Good evening. I'm Evelyn Brooks, and this is Echoes of 1970. Tonight, I'm holding a tape that's been sitting in my archive for months. I've listened to it 12 times, and each time, I had to stop. Not because the recording is damaged, not because the story is incomplete, but because what Roy Jenkins confessed that night in 1978 wasn't just a secret. It was a wound that never healed. It was a choice that destroyed lives. And it was a silence that lasted 15 years. No one knew why Roy stayed silent for so long. But deep down, they knew something was ending. They could feel it in the way he looked at them, in the way his hands trembled when he held a wrench, in the way he stopped going to church, stopped smiling, stopped living. Roy Jenkins was 43 years old when he finally spoke. He was a mechanic in a small town called Millbrook, Virginia. One of those places where everyone knows your name, your business, and your secrets. Population, 3,047. One main street, 2 churches, 3 bars, and Roy's garage on Route 9. The kind of place where everyone brought their cars, their stories, their trust. Roy was the man you called when your engine died at midnight. He was the man who fixed things. He was the man who never said no, never asked questions, never judged. But there was one thing he never fixed, and it destroyed the most beloved family in town. 15 years earlier, in the summer of 1963, a car crashed into the Miller family's station wagon. Margaret Miller, her husband Thomas, and their 2 daughters, Emma, age 9, and Claire, age 7, died instantly. The driver of the other car walked away with a broken arm. The police said it was brake failure, a tragic accident. Nothing more. But Roy knew the truth. He had touched those brakes. He had seen what was wrong. He had taken the money. And he never said a word. Before we talk about what Roy did, we need to talk about who Roy was. Because guilt doesn't just fall on anyone. It finds the cracks. It finds the weaknesses. And Roy Jenkins had plenty of both. Roy was born in Millbrook in 1935. His father, William Jenkins, owned the same garage Roy would later inherit. William was a hard man, the kind who believed that work was prayer and silence was strength. He taught Roy how to fix engines before Roy could read. He taught him that a man's word was his bond, and he taught him that money was the only thing that kept a family safe. William died in 1958, when Roy was 23, heart attack, dropped dead in the middle of changing someone's oil. Roy found him lying under a Buick, wrench still in his hand. Roy inherited the garage, the debts, and the weight of being William Jenkins's son. People expected him to be just like his father, strong, silent, unbreakable, so that's what Roy became. Or at least, that's what he tried to be. But here's the thing you need to understand. Roy wasn't his father. He was softer, kinder. He'd give people discounts when he knew they couldn't afford the full price. He'd stay late to finish a job because someone needed their car for work the next morning. He was the kind of man people trusted, the kind of man people relied on. And that's exactly why what happened in 1963 broke him so completely. In 1961, Roy married Linda Patterson. She was a school teacher, pretty, smart, with a laugh that could fill a room. They had a son, Danny, in 1957. By all accounts, they were happy. They had a small house on Maple Street. They went to church on Sundays. They had friends. They had a future. But they also had debts. William had left the garage in bad shape. Roy was working 70-hour weeks just to keep the lights on. Linda was working 2 jobs, teaching during the day, waitressing at night. And still, they were barely scraping by. Money was always tight. Bills were always late. And Roy felt the weight of it every single day. He felt like he was failing his wife, failing his son, failing his father's memory. So when Carl walked into his garage on June 14, 1963, Roy was already a man on the edge. He just didn't know how far he was about to fall. Let me take you back to that day. June 14, 1963. It was a Friday, the kind of summer day that makes you feel like the heat is melting the world. Over 90 degrees. No breeze. Just thick, heavy air that sat on your chest like a hand. Roy's garage smelled like oil, burnt rubber, and old coffee. The radio was playing something by the Beatles. Please Please Me, I think. Roy was under a blue Chevy Impala, replacing a busted transmission, when he heard the bell ring above the door. He slid out from under the car, wiping his hands on a rag that hadn't been clean in weeks. His back hurt, his knees hurt, everything hurt. But he smiled anyway, because that's what you did when a customer walked in. Standing in the doorway was a man Roy had never seen before. Tall, maybe 6'2", thin, but not weak, wearing a dark suit that looked expensive, but worn. Sunglasses, slicked back hair. He looked like he was from somewhere else, somewhere bigger, somewhere dangerous. The man took off his sunglasses and looked at Roy. His eyes were cold, empty, like looking into a frozen lake. He said his name was Carl, no last name, just Carl. He said he was passing through town and his brakes felt soft. Could Roy take a look? Wait, don't miss this detail. Roy nodded. He always nodded. That's what you did when someone needed help. That's what his father had taught him. You don't turn people away, you don't ask questions, you just do the work. Carl handed him the keys to a black Ford Fairlane parked outside. Roy walked out, opened the hood, checked the fluid levels. Everything looked normal, so he got in the car, started it up, and drove it into the garage. Roy put the car up on the lift and crawled underneath, and that's when he saw it. The brake line had been cut, not worn down, not rusted, cut, deliberately, carefully, precisely, just enough that the brakes would hold for a little while, maybe a few days, maybe a week, and then fail completely. Roy's heart started pounding. He'd seen a lot of things in his years as a mechanic. He'd seen careless mistakes, shoddy repairs, parts that failed because they were cheap. But this wasn't any of that. This was intentional. Roy slid back out from under the car. His hands were shaking. He looked over at Carl, who was standing by the door, smoking a cigarette, staring out at the road like he didn't have a care in the world. Roy wiped his hands on his rag and walked over. He tried to keep his voice steady. He said, "Your brake line's been cut. This isn't wear and tear. Someone did this on purpose." Carl didn't even flinch. He just took another drag of his cigarette and said, "I know." Roy didn't know what to say. He just stood there, staring at this man, trying to understand what he'd just heard. Finally, Carl turned to look at him, and he said, "How much to fix it so it works for a few more days? Just enough to get me where I need to go?" You won't believe what happened next. Roy's mind was racing. He knew what Carl was asking. He was asking Roy to make the brakes work just long enough for Carl to get somewhere, and then for them to fail, which meant Carl was planning to hurt someone, or kill someone. Roy should have said no. He should have told Carl to get out. He should have called the police. But then Carl pulled out a roll of cash. Thick, rubber-banded. He peeled off 10 $20 bills and laid them on the workbench. $200. In 1963, $200 was a fortune. It was more than Roy made in a month. It was enough to pay off 3 months of overdue bills. It was enough to keep the lights on. It was enough to give Linda and Danny a little breathing room. Carl looked at Roy and said, "You fix the brakes. You make them last a few more days. And you didn't see anything. You don't know me. I was never here." Then he smiled. Not a friendly smile. A smile that said, "I know you're going to say, yes." Roy stood there for what felt like an eternity. He looked at the money. He looked at Carl. He looked at the car sitting on the lift. And then he looked at the framed photo on his workbench. Linda and Danny, smiling, happy. Roy picked up the money. He said, "I'll have it ready in an hour." Carl nodded. "Good man," he said. Then he walked outside, lit another cigarette, and waited. That's when everything changed. Roy worked in silence. He didn't put on the radio. He didn't hum. He didn't think. He just worked. He repaired the brake line just enough that it would hold, maybe for 50 miles, maybe for 100, but not forever. Never forever. When he was done, he lowered the car, wiped his hands, and walked outside. Carl was leaning against the building, finishing his cigarette. Roy handed him the keys. Carl took them, got in the car, and started the engine. He rolled down the window and looked at Roy one last time. He said, "You're a good man, Roy. Don't ever forget that." And then he drove away. Roy stood there in the parking lot, the $200 folded in his pocket, the smell of exhaust still hanging in the air, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he'd just sold his soul. 3 days later, on Sunday, June 17th, 1963, the Miller family was driving home from church. It was a beautiful morning. Blue sky, light breeze, the kind of day that makes you grateful to be alive. Margaret Miller had baked a peach pie that morning. Her daughters, Emma and Claire, were in the back seat, arguing about who got to hold the pie on the way home. Thomas was driving, one hand on the wheel, the other holding Margaret's hand. They were talking about summer plans. Thomas wanted to take the girls to the lake. Margaret wanted to visit her sister in Richmond. They were laughing. They were happy. They were safe. They were heading south on Route 9, about 2 miles from home, when a black Ford Fairlane ran a stop sign at full speed. Thomas saw it at the last second. He jerked the wheel to the right, but it was too late. The Ford slammed into the driver's side door at 60 miles an hour. Margaret Miller died on impact. So did Thomas. Emma and Claire were still breathing when the first person arrived at the scene, a farmer named Dutch Calloway, who lived a quarter-mile down the road. He heard the crash and came running. Dutch said later that he'd never forget the sound. Not the crash itself, but the silence after. The way the world just stopped. Emma died in Dutch's arms. She was 9 years old. She asked for her mother. Dutch told her everything was going to be okay. It wasn't. Claire died in the ambulance. She was 7. She never woke up. The driver of the Ford Fairlane, Carl, was found sitting on the side of the road, 50 feet from the wreck. His arm was broken. He had some bruises, but he was alive, and he was calm. Too calm. The police asked him what happened. He said his brakes failed. He said he tried to stop, but the pedal went to the floor. He said it was an accident. The police investigated. They inspected the Ford, and sure enough, the brake line had ruptured. Complete failure. The report said it was a mechanical malfunction. Probable cause: corrosion or faulty installation. Carl was cited for running a stop sign and reckless driving, but because the brake failure was classified as mechanical, he wasn't charged with manslaughter. He paid a fine. He left town 2 weeks later. No one ever saw him again. But the most shocking part was yet to come. The funeral for the Miller family was held at First Baptist Church on June 22nd. Nearly the entire town showed up. Over 500 people. The church couldn't hold them all, so people stood outside in the heat, crying, praying, trying to make sense of something that made no sense. Margaret Miller had been a nurse at Millbrook General. She delivered half the babies in town. She'd held people's hands when they were dying. She was the kind of person who made the world better just by being in it. Thomas Miller was a high school history teacher and the coach of the baseball team. Every kid in town loved him. He had a way of making you feel like you mattered, like you could do anything. Emma wanted to be a veterinarian. Claire wanted to be a dancer. They were just kids. They had whole lives ahead of them. And Roy Jenkins stood at the back of that church, wearing a black suit he'd borrowed from his neighbor, and he felt the weight of every single person in that room crushing him. Because he knew. He knew that Carl had killed them. He knew that Carl had planned it, and he knew that he, Roy Jenkins, had made it possible. At the end of the service, people filed past the 4 caskets: Margaret, Thomas, Emma, Claire, lined up in a row, flowers everywhere, photos of them smiling. Roy stood in line. He didn't want to. He wanted to run. But Linda was next to him, holding his hand, crying quietly, and he couldn't leave. So he stood there, waiting, feeling like he was walking toward his own execution. When it was his turn, he stopped in front of Emma's casket. She looked so small, so still, like she was just sleeping. And that's when Roy looked up and saw him. Even now, Roy was still holding on. Carl, standing at the back of the church, wearing the same dark suit, the same sunglasses, not crying, not praying, just watching. Their eyes met. Carl didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just looked at Roy. And Roy knew Carl wanted him to see, wanted him to know, wanted him to carry this forever. And then Carl turned and walked out. For 15 years, Roy Jenkins carried that secret. He went to work every morning. He fixed cars. He came home every night. He ate dinner with Linda and Danny. He paid his bills. He mowed his lawn. He lived, but he wasn't alive. Not really. The $200 Carl had given him, Roy spent it. He had to. He paid off the electric bill, the water bill, bought groceries, fixed the roof. The money was gone within a month, but the guilt stayed forever. Every time Roy drove past the crash site on Route 9, he saw them. Margaret, Thomas, Emma, Claire. He saw their faces. He heard their voices. He felt their presence. What you've heard so far is only the beginning. The town put up a memorial, a small wooden cross on the side of the road, right where the crash happened. Someone, Roy never found out who, carved their names into it. Margaret Miller, Thomas Miller, Emma Miller, Claire Miller. June 17th, 1963. Roy stopped at that cross every single day on his way home from work. He never got out of the truck. He just sat there, engine idling, staring at those names, trying to find the courage to tell the truth. But he never did. Roy's marriage started falling apart. Linda said he'd changed, that he didn't talk anymore, that he'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, mumbling names she didn't recognize. She'd ask him what was wrong, and he'd say, "Nothing, just a bad dream." But it wasn't a dream. It was a memory, a loop that never stopped playing. Linda tried everything. She suggested he see a doctor. She asked if he wanted to talk to Pastor Reynolds. She even asked if he wanted to go on a vacation, just the three of them, get away for a while. But Roy said no to everything. He couldn't leave Millbrook. He couldn't leave that cross, because if he did, he felt like he'd be abandoning them, like he'd be letting them disappear. But here's the thing. Roy wasn't honoring them. He was punishing himself, and in doing so, he was destroying everyone around him. Danny Jenkins grew up with a father who was there but wasn't there. Roy would sit at the dinner table, but he wouldn't talk. He'd go to Danny's baseball games, but he wouldn't cheer. He'd tuck Danny in at night, but he wouldn't smile. Danny once told a friend, years later after everything came out, that he felt like his dad was a ghost, like he was haunted by something no one else could see. By the time Danny was 15, he and Roy barely spoke. By the time Danny was 18, he left for college and never came back. Not for holidays, not for birthdays, not for anything. Linda filed for divorce in 1976. She said she couldn't do it anymore. She said she'd spent 15 years living with a stranger. She said she still loved Roy, but she didn't know who he was anymore. Roy didn't fight it. He signed the papers. He moved into a small apartment above the garage. And he kept working, because work was the only thing that kept him from thinking. But even work became torture. Every time someone brought their car in for brake work, Roy's hands would shake. Every time he crawled under a car, he saw that black Ford Fairlane. Every time he heard the hiss of air brakes or the screech of tires, his heart would stop. He started drinking. Not heavily, just enough to dull the edges, just enough to sleep without dreaming. He'd sit in his apartment at night, alone, with a bottle of whiskey and that framed photo of Linda and Danny, and he'd ask himself the same question over and over again. Why didn't I say something? And the answer was always the same. Because you were scared, because you were weak, because you chose money over lives. Even the strongest hearts can break in silence. In 1977, 14 years after the crash, something happened that changed everything. The town decided to build a park in memory of the Miller family, Miller Memorial Park. It was dedicated on June 17, 1977, the 14th anniversary of their deaths. The whole town came out. There were speeches, prayers, a ribbon cutting. The mayor unveiled a bronze plaque with their names on it. Roy was there, standing at the back of the crowd, watching. And that's when he saw her. A young woman, mid-20s, dark hair, standing by the plaque, crying quietly. She placed a bouquet of white lilies at the base of the plaque and then walked away. Roy didn't know who she was, but something about her, something in the way she moved, the way she carried herself, made him feel like he'd seen her before. You won't believe what happened next. Roy followed her. Not close, just followed. She walked 3 blocks to a small diner on Main Street and went inside. Roy waited across the street for 10 minutes, trying to decide what to do. Finally, he went in. The woman was sitting in a booth by the window, drinking coffee, staring out at nothing. Roy walked over and stood there, awkward, unsure, his heart pounding. He said, "Excuse me, I saw you at the memorial. Did you know the Millers?" The woman looked up at him. Her eyes were red from crying. She nodded. She said, "I'm Rachel. Thomas Miller was my uncle." Roy felt like the floor had just disappeared beneath him. He sat down across from her without asking. His hands were shaking. His voice was barely a whisper. He said, "I'm sorry for your loss." Rachel looked at him for a long time, and then she said something that made Roy's blood run cold. She said, "I know who you are, Mr. Jenkins. I know what you did." Roy couldn't breathe. He tried to speak, but no words came out. Rachel just sat there, staring at him, her expression unreadable. Finally, Roy managed to say, "I don't know what you're talking about." Rachel leaned forward. Her voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. She said, 3 years ago, I tracked down the man who killed my family. His name was Carl Devereaux. He was living in Baltimore, dying of lung cancer. And before he died, he told me everything. Roy felt like he was falling, like the world was spinning and he couldn't stop it. Rachel continued, "He told me about the brake line, about the money, about you. Wait, don't miss this detail." Roy's first instinct was to deny it, to lie, to run. But he couldn't, because the truth was sitting across from him, looking him in the eye, and he was so tired of running. So instead he said, "Why didn't you go to the police?" Rachel looked down at her coffee. "Because Carl was already dying. And because I wanted to understand. I wanted to know why. Why he did it. Why you helped him. Why my family had to die." She looked back up at Roy. "Carl told me he was hired to kill Thomas. Someone wanted him dead. He never told me who. He said the girls and Margaret were collateral damage. That's what he called them. Collateral damage." Roy closed his eyes. Tears were streaming down his face. Rachel said, "I don't care about Carl anymore. He's dead. But you're still here. And I need to know, was it worth it? Was $200 worth their lives?" Roy sat there, crying, unable to speak. And then, for the first time in 15 years, he told the truth. All of it. Every detail. Every lie. Every sleepless night. He confessed it all. He told Rachel about the debts. About the pressure. About the fear. About how he convinced himself it was just a brake repair. Just a job. Just money. About how he didn't think about who Carl might hurt. About how, by the time he realized what he'd done, it was too late. And when he was done, Rachel looked at him and said, "I came here to hate you. I wanted to scream at you. I wanted to hurt you the way you hurt my family. But now, I just feel sorry for you. Because you've been in prison for 15 years. You just didn't have bars." That's when everything changed. Rachel stood up. She placed a napkin on the table. Written on it was an address. She said, "That's where I'm staying. If you want to make this right, come see me tomorrow, noon, and bring the truth with you." Then she walked out. Roy didn't sleep that night. He sat in his apartment, staring at that napkin, trying to decide what to do. He thought about running. He thought about ending it all. He thought about pretending the conversation never happened. But he couldn't, because for the first time in 15 years, someone else knew the truth, and that changed everything. The next day, at exactly noon, Roy knocked on Rachel's door. She opened it. She didn't smile. She just stepped aside and let him in. Her apartment was small, clean. There were photos on the walls. Thomas, Margaret, Emma, Claire, smiling, alive. Roy sat down on the couch. Rachel sat across from him. She said, "I thought about it all night, and I decided something. I'm not going to the police, not yet." Roy looked up, confused. Rachel continued, "Because you're going to do it yourself. You're going to walk into that station and tell them what you did. Not because I'm forcing you, but because it's the only way you'll ever be free." Roy said, "They'll send me to prison." Rachel nodded. "Probably, but at least you'll be able to sleep at night." Roy left Rachel's apartment and walked straight to the Millbrook police station. It was a Tuesday, October 10th, 1978, 15 years, 3 months, and 23 days after the crash. He walked in and asked to speak to Sheriff Tom Brewster. Tom had been a deputy back in 1963. He remembered the Miller case. Everyone did. Roy sat down in Tom's office, and he said, "I need to tell you something about the Miller crash. Something I should have told you 15 years ago." Tom leaned back in his chair. "Go ahead." And Roy told him everything. The case was reopened immediately. Roy was arrested and charged as an accessory to manslaughter. The news spread through Millbrook like wildfire. People couldn't believe it. Roy Jenkins? The mechanic everyone trusted? The man who'd fixed their cars for 20 years? Some people were furious. They called him a coward, a murderer. They wanted him to rot in prison. Others were conflicted. They'd known Roy their whole lives. They'd seen him at that memorial every single day. They knew he was suffering. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Roy pled guilty. He didn't try to defend himself. He didn't make excuses. He just told the truth. Even now, Roy was still holding on. His lawyer argued for leniency. He said Roy had been coerced, that he'd lived with guilt for 15 years, that he'd turned himself in. The prosecution argued that Roy had taken money to help a killer, that 4 people were dead because of his choice, that guilt wasn't punishment enough. On November 18, 1978, Roy Jenkins was sentenced to 8 years in prison. With good behavior, he could be out in 5. As they led him out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Roy looked back at the gallery. Rachel was sitting in the front row. She wasn't crying. She wasn't smiling. She just nodded. And Roy nodded back. Roy served his time at Greensville Correctional Center, about 60 miles from Millbrook. He kept his head down. He didn't cause trouble. He worked in the prison library, shelving books, helping inmates who couldn't read. Linda never visited. Danny never wrote. Roy didn't blame them. He'd lost that right 15 years ago. But Rachel did visit. Once a month. Every month. For 3 years. At first, they didn't talk much. Rachel would sit across from him in the visiting room, and they'd just exist together. 2 people bound by the same tragedy. But slowly, over time, they started to talk. About the Millers, about guilt, about forgiveness, about what it means to carry something you can never put down. Rachel once told Roy, "I don't forgive you. I don't think I ever will. But I don't hate you anymore. And I think that's enough." Roy said, "It's more than I deserve." Rachel shook her head. "Maybe, but it's what I'm giving you anyway." Roy was released in 1983. He'd served 5 years. He was 48 years old. He had no wife, no son, no home, no job, just a bus ticket back to Millbrook and $73 in his pocket. He could have gone anywhere, started over, changed his name. But he didn't. He went back to Millbrook, because that's where the Millers were, and that's where he needed to be. Roy didn't try to rebuild his old life. He didn't reopen the garage. He didn't reach out to Linda or Danny. He got a job washing dishes at the diner on Main Street. He rented a tiny room above a laundromat, and every single Sunday, he went to the crash site on Route 9. The memorial had grown over the years. The wooden cross had been replaced with a stone marker. Someone, Roy never found out who, had planted flowers around it. Roses, lilies, daisies. Roy would bring his own flowers. He'd clean the marker, pull the weeds, sit on the ground and talk to them. He'd tell Margaret about the weather. He'd tell Thomas about the baseball scores. He'd tell Emma and Claire about the kids he saw playing in the park. He'd tell them he was sorry. Over and over and over again. What you've heard so far is only the beginning. People in town saw him. Some crossed the street to avoid him. Some spat on the ground as he walked by. But some, just a few, nodded. Not forgiveness, just acknowledgement. In 1985, 2 years after his release, Roy was at the memorial when a car pulled up. A woman got out. It was Rachel. She walked over and stood next to him. They didn't say anything for a while. Just stood there, looking at the names on the marker. Finally, Rachel said, "I'm leaving Millbrook. I got a job in Atlanta. I wanted to say goodbye." Roy nodded. "I understand." Rachel looked at him. "Do you ever think about stopping, coming here every week?" Roy shook his head. "No. This is where I belong. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, My uncle used to say that the only way to make up for a mistake is to spend the rest of your life doing better. I think you're doing that. Roy started crying. Rachel put a hand on his shoulder, and then she got back in her car and drove away. Roy never saw her again. Roy Jenkins lived in Millbrook for another 10 years. He kept washing dishes. He kept going to the memorial. He kept living. In 1990, Danny came back to town. He was 33, married, 2 kids. He'd heard Roy was sick, emphysema, from years of breathing in car exhaust and cigarette smoke. Danny went to see him. They sat in Roy's tiny room above the laundromat. They didn't hug. They didn't cry. They just talked. Danny said, I don't know if I can forgive you for what you did to them. But I forgive you for what you did to us. To me and Mom. Roy said, That's more than I ever hoped for. Danny stood up to leave. At the door, he turned back and said, You were a coward once, but you're not anymore. Even the strongest hearts can break in silence. Roy Jenkins died on March 3, 1995. He was 60 years old. Heart attack. He was found in his room by the landlord, slumped over at his desk, pen still in his hand. He'd been writing a letter. It was addressed to no one. It just said, I'm sorry, I'll always be sorry, but I tried. The funeral was small. 15 people. Danny was there, a few people from the diner, and to everyone's surprise, Rachel. She'd flown in from Atlanta. After the service, Rachel went to the crash site. She placed flowers on the memorial, and then she placed flowers on Roy's grave, which was in the same cemetery, 50 yards away. Someone asked her why. She said, Because guilt is a prison, and he served his sentence. I think about Roy Jenkins a lot. I think about the choice he made in 1963. I think about the 15 years he stayed silent. I think about the 5 years he spent in prison. And I think about the 10 years he spent at that memorial. Was it enough? I don't know. Redemption isn't something you earn. It's something you chase. And Roy chased it until the day he died. The Miller family is still remembered in Millbrook. There's a scholarship in their name at the high school. The park is still there. And every year, on June 17th, someone leaves flowers at the crash site. No one knows who. But I think it's someone who understands that guilt doesn't die. It just changes shape. Roy sent me this tape a week before he died, along with a letter. The letter said, I don't know if anyone will care, but I need someone to know that I'm sorry. Not because it changes anything, but because silence is worse than guilt. I've kept this tape for years. I didn't know if I should share it. But I think Roy wanted people to know that mistakes don't define you. But what you do after, that's what matters. This has been Echoes of 1970. I'm Evelyn Brooks. And if you're carrying something you can't say out loud, maybe it's time to let it go. Not for them, but for you.